You are live.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to call this meeting to order at 10:04 a.m. and that would be on Monday, July 13th, 2020. I would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the lands traditionally occupied by Indigenous peoples. They continue to care for this land. They continue to shape the township of Georgian Bay today, and we want to show our respect. Hundreds of years after the first treaties were signed, they remain relevant today in guiding our decisions and actions. Megwich. I would like also to add to that acknowledgement the fact that the Indigenous people have shown a very long-term perspective on their decisions and the lives they lead. They refer to 7 generations, and we have to think 7 generations ahead and learn from 7 generations behind. And I think we have to remember that long-term perspective as we face the decisions that are in front of us, not only in this meeting, but in our following meeting. And with that, I'd like to go to item 3, which asks any of my fellow councillors whether they have any declarations of pecuniary interest with regards to the Planning Council agenda of today. I'm seeing heads shaking and no hands raised, so I'll presume that's a no. I have a motion in front of me that reads, moved by Councillor Cooper, seconded by Councillor Douglas. Be it resolved, the Planning Council adopts the agenda of July 13th, 2020 as circulated. All those in favor? And that is carried. Thank you. And with that, we're going to go into the planning application is not subject to a public meeting, specifically Development Services 2020-29. It's a site plan application by HH or MB Limited Partnership and removal of the holding symbol application for 380 Macy Bay Road. And with that, I will turn the floor over to staff. Mr. Robinson, will you be making the presentation?
Yes, Your Worship, I will be making the presentation today.
Oh. I normally would say the floor is yours, but perhaps it should be the screen is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, members of council and members of the public that are watching. I'm just going to share my screen here. I've got a presentation which will help outline and provide a bit of a history of the application and a summary of the site plan application and the agreements that are before council today. So just bear with me one second. Can everybody see that okay? Okay, so again, what we've got before council here, this is again not a statutory public meeting. This is the consideration of a staff report, and the purpose of the staff report is twofold. It's to consider an application for site plan and to consider an application for removal of a holding symbol. This is for the site located at 380 Macy Bay Road, and it's the property that was subject to a previous OMB decisions and has been subject to a number of recent council meetings. This map shows the location of the property. So the outer line that's hatched shows roughly the limits of the Macy Bay site. And then the area in red is the approximate lands of the CT2-6H zoning, which is the current zoning on the site. Again, the removal of the holding symbol bylaw that's before council as part of this meeting would remove the holding symbol from the site. The reason why I say the red line is the approximate limits, this is a little bit older map, and the limits of the CT2-6 zoning have been modified slightly, or I guess the correct word is refined slightly, based on the limits of the provincially significant wetland boundary. And if you recall, or if you're familiar with the Ontario Municipal Board decision from 2017, it effectively held that decision until the mapping associated with the limits of the PSW boundary had been confirmed, and they have been since confirmed. So there's a few modifications in these areas of the site, and those updated provincially significant wetland boundaries, and the setbacks from those have been reflected on the site plans that council will be looking at today. So just in terms of a summary of the process, the site plan application was submitted in at the end of 2016, prior to the Ontario Municipal Board decision. What that Ontario Municipal Board hearing dealt with were there's actually 4 appeals. There was appeals from the proponent, and then appeals from a neighbor group, and those appeals related to the official plans, the township official plan, as well as the township zoning bylaw and the preparation of those documents. So the site plan application supporting material was submitted and provided for review. The township did retain a number of peer review consultants. Those peer review consultants are on the line today. If there's any specific questions that there's no presentation that they're making, but if there's a specific question of council that I can't answer, we may rely on those folks to provide a response. There have been a few iterations of the site plan agreement, or sorry, the site plan application submission based on the peer review comments. So there's been some back and forth through that process. All of that information is available on the township's website under Document Center, Macy Bay. There was a public open house meeting held last summer, and that public open house meeting, the peer review consultants and the proponents consultants were available to answer questions with respect to the proposed development and the supporting studies that had been prepared. This next bullet relates to the notice. So notice of the site plan application was provided on October 11th, 2019. That's consistent with a resolution that was passed by council in the fall of 2019 that required notice to be provided for all commercial site plan applications in the municipality. That's something that's not required under the Planning Act, but it's a resolution that this council passed to notify residents where site plan applications have been made. Staff are recommending, as part of this report, approval of the site plan application and authorization for the mayor and the clerk to enter into the site plan agreement with the proponent. This proposed report, this report also deals with the removal of a holding application and removal of a holding symbol. And the basis for removal of the holding symbol are outlined in the OMB decision, and specifically outlined in the CT2-6H zoning. And it's staff's opinion that the requirements for removal of the holding symbol have been met. And just a bit of a background about holding symbols: they're used when principle of land use has been established in an area, but there's some outlying technical considerations that need to be addressed. We typically find them used in urban areas, for example, where the principle of residential or commercial use has been established and the zoning gets applied, but there may not be capacity available in a sewage system or pipes in place. And once the capacity is available or the pipes are in place, then the holding symbol gets removed. So in this case, there was a number of conditions related to the completion of studies, and those requirements have been met. And I'll deal with that at one of the last slides in the presentation. So again, as I mentioned, it's staff's opinion that the requirements for the removal of the holding symbol have been satisfied. There have been a number of comments provided on the site plan and the matters related to the site plan, and staff have considered those comments that were provided up until, I believe it was Wednesday when the staff report was released. So anything that effectively came in before last Wednesday was considered as part of the staff report. There is a sewage system that's proposed on the site. It is a private system, and it's classified as a private system because it's one single property. Although there's multiple users, it still falls within a private, it's still characterized as a private system. Because of the size of the system being over 10,000 liters, the approval authority is the MECP, which is the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. And they have received an approval of that system. There is a judicial review that's been submitted by the the Eastern Georgian Bay Protective Society. And that judicial review is looking at the appropriateness of the MECP process in issuing that approval. And it really specifically, it's my understanding that it specifically relates to the fact that the application was not posted on the environmental registry for comment. I just wanted to point out as well that the township official plan does require, does contain some phosphorus policies related to the importance of removing phosphorus, and those mitigation techniques have been included in the septic system. And it's staff's opinion that they do conform to the official plan on that basis. The site from a water perspective will be serviced with Georgian Bay lake water. There has been a permit to take water provided by MECP associated with that as well. I would like to just clarify, in my staff report, I did identify that it was a communal system. It's actually a private system for the same reasons that I alluded to with respect to the sewage system, that it is a private site and it's not servicing multiple lots. Although there are multiple users on the site, it's one lot. In terms of detailed studies, there have been detailed studies completed that do look at natural heritage features, and it's staff and the peer review consultants' opinions that the provincial, district, and township policies and regulations pertaining to those natural heritage features have been met. And I just wanted to make one of the key components of the site plan agreement is that it does require monitoring to take place throughout the build out of the site, and does require securities to be provided by the developer. And I'll provide a bit more detail about that as we go forward. In terms of supporting studies and peer reviews, this schedule or this slide identifies the peer reviews and the supporting studies that were provided. So we had studies dealing with servicing, which water, sewage, stormwater management, those sorts of items. We've got a study dealing with hydrogeology, a study which is the impact on water, a study dealing with the environmental impact study that deals with natural heritage features. We've got a study dealing with transportation and the road aspect and access to the site. And finally, a study dealing with phosphorus management. And a list of the proponents, experts, as well as the township experts are provided here. Again, individuals from both the proponents team and the township peer review consultants are available should there be any specific questions that I'm not, myself or other members of staff are not able to answer, but they are not intending to speak today. They're only available should there be any questions related to their specific discipline. What I'd like to do now is provide a bit of an overview of the site plan itself. And with the application, there's 5 specific drawings, I'll call them, that are, or schedules associated with the proposed site plan agreement. And I'd like to just walk you through the workings of the site and the workings of the site plan agreement. So in terms of the various schedules, the first one that we see here is the site plan. We've got a second one that deals with site servicing. So it identifies how the site will be serviced. And then drawings 3, 4, and 5 specifically deal with a potential layout for the pod areas. And I'll get into some more detail about the pod areas as we work through this. I will try to enlarge the screen slightly as we go through this to provide a bit more detail, but talking at a high level, this is the entrance. If you can see my cursor, this is the entrance to the site from Macy Bay Road. This is the area of the current waterfront along here and the existing dock. There's no additional docking structures or or changes along the waterfront proposed as a result of this site plan application. What's proposed from a specific, where the units would be identified are within the specific pod areas. So we've got them identified as areas 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So those are the locations where specific units would be permitted. And then just in terms of the internal workings of the site, the entrance to the site is in this area here, and vehicles would travel into the site to a parking area. So there's a parking area established in the central portion of the site. It's not visible or can't be viewed from outside of the site. It's interior to the site. There's an overflow parking area identified in this area. So what would happen is individuals would travel into the site, park their car, and then there's a system of internal trailways within the development. So cars would not travel throughout the site. There would be golf carts that would take individuals to their trailers throughout the site. So you'll see in the next drawing that there's effectively a loop road that's existing in this area. And again, for the most part, that loop road uses existing infrastructure that's in place now and existing trailways. And then there's a series of other smaller trailways that are central to the site that provide access to the specific units. This area in hatching, which you can see in more detail in the next drawing, is the area of the sewage treatment facility. The main sewage treatment bed is located in this facility, in this area here. A second sewage treatment bed, if necessary, is proposed to be located in this area here. There's a maintenance building located in this area. It would have a gym and washroom facilities also proposed in that building. There's propane storage and those sorts of items to the rear in this area. In terms of amenity space, there's amenity space located here in this green hatching, and as well in this area that's considered passive amenity space. There's a proposed pool location here, and as well as a gazebo and sports court in that area as well. So those are the recreation amenities that are associated with the proposed development. I'll just touch on some of the environmental features as well with respect to the site. So obviously Georgian Bay itself is an important water body. Development has been proposed, and the location of the trailer sites has been proposed to be set back some distance from the water. I guess one other thing I should have mentioned was there's 3 existing cottages located on the site. Those are proposed to be maintained. The one cottage in this location is proposed to be a clubhouse, and there's an existing boat launch ramp in this location here that's proposed to be maintained as well. So back to environmental features. So in terms of the features, as I indicated earlier, and this red line does have to be modified to reflect the new CT2-6 zone boundary, but the limits of the PSW have been appropriately recognized on this site plan, and the 30-meter setback from the PSW is the purple line. And then in addition to that, there's a central water course through the site. There is proposed to be between 15 and 25 meter setback for development from that water course that travels north-south through the property. And I'll get into a little bit more detail about how the 15 meters and how the 20 meters is determined, but effectively in the construction management plan, which I'll get into some detail in a moment on, what that construction management plan will require is a 25-meter setback for all development for all site alteration from that water course. And then as the specific pod development plans are provided for each of the pods, in consultation and review with the environmental consultants based on the results of the studies that have been prepared and peer reviewed, that buffer could be modified in some locations to 15 meters, but maintained at 25 in other locations. So that would be the process for how we deal with the 15 to 25 meter requirement for that buffer adjacent to the north-south water course. All of the other environmental features are for the most part protected in the 30-meter buffer that's adjacent to the provincially significant wetland that borders much of the site. And in addition to that, from a species at risk perspective, there's permitting that's required from the MOECP associated with species at risk. Staff have spoken with MOECP staff. They have identified that they have not issued permits yet associated with species at risk. They said they would not issue permits until the site plan agreement is entered into by the township. And they indicated that even if the agreement were entered into today, for example, or authorization were provided today, is unlikely they'd issue any permits until the fall, just based on their current workload. And that also aligns because there's some timing restrictions associated with works on the site due to the species that that exist that wouldn't allow or wouldn't enable site works to be undertaken through these summer months anyways. So it's from their perspective, the issue, there's no specific immediate timeline for the need for those permits because of the timing windows associated with them. So the earliest MNR staff or MOE staff has indicated is that those permits could come in the fall, and that's subject to the township entering into the site plan agreement. So that provides a bit of an overview of the workings of the site. I'll just move into now the sewage component and the trailway component. So this is the second schedule to the plan, and what this identifies is in more detail where the potential trailways would be located. So we've got the main, we'll call it a ring road around the outside that is proposed, that is a 6-meter trailway. And then the interior access ways, which are identified in red on this figure, are proposed to be 3-meter trailways. I'll get into some detail. We have reviewed this with the fire chief, and he's comfortable with the concept of 6 meters and 3 meters for the interior trailways. And one of the requirements in the site plan agreement is that all the units would be sprinklered as well. They're required to be sprinklered for fire suppression. So as you can see, you would enter the site, you would park your vehicle and travel on the green and the red pathways to get to where the proposed trailer units would be identified or would be located. There might be some modification of these specific trailways within the development pods. And as these development pods are developed, the site plan agreement requires the submission of detailed engineering plans and detailed plans for each of the development pods to be reviewed by the municipality. And then again, here's the location of the sewage treatment facility and the sewage beds, and the water intake facilities are within the pumping equipment is within the maintenance building. So the next couple of slides, or the next 3 slides, identify some more details about the specific specific development pods. And again, this site plan is somewhat unique, and it's not what you would typically see in an urban situation or from an urban site plan. This is, again, it's a trailer park. It's a trailer park that's on the Canadian Shield, and the specific orientation and siting of each trailer within these development pods is not yet known. What these drawings provide is a conceptual build out that would identify how these pods could be oriented. But when specific development plans are provided for each one of these pods, the township will have to provide sign off, and there have to be a demonstration that compliance with the municipality's bylaws are met. At the top here, we see a couple sample orientations. So these provide a couple of the different units styles that are proposed. And you can see within this pod, for example, there's some of the units that are identified on the right-hand side here in this location. And there's some of the other units that are identified in other locations. So if there's some of the wider units proposed, if there's more wider units proposed, they would achieve less units within one of these blocks. But the overall max density across the site is 180 units. And as units are proposed, they'll be required to provide grading plans and details associated with each of the blocks. And you'll note from the site plan agreement that there's requirements that they provide a report for the preparation of each of these areas that identify the protection of features within those areas, that identify how low impact design is being incorporated. So things like stormwater management, low impact design, and mitigating runoff, and those sorts of items for each one of these pod areas. And that's consistent with the supporting studies that have been prepared and the peer review comments that have been provided on those items. So this figure identifies some of the additional development pods, so pretty consistent with what was identified on the previous slide, but it does show again the location of the trailways, the major trailways, and then the minor trailways and potential unit configurations. And again, staff submissions will be made when trailers are proposed to be placed, and staff will have to ensure compliance with all of the supporting studies that have been provided, but also the zoning bylaw. The zoning bylaw contains specific requirements for separation of trailers from one another and location on each one of these sites. From a landscaping perspective, I just wanted to identify for council there's a landscape plan that's included as part of the development submission and site plan package. The focus on the landscape plan, and this just provides a snapshot of the one area, but the focus of the landscape plan is the waterfront and the entrance to the site. Those are the two areas that are can be where the development or the site can be viewed from outside. So someone boating on Georgian Bay could see the site, and someone entering the site from Macy Bay Road can see the site. The township was not, and staff was not particularly concerned about the landscaping that occurs within the site. It is a private site interior to that. And we've got a number of requirements for vegetation protection that are aligned with the various buffers from the features that exist, and then also aligned with the supporting studies. So again, when any development is proposed of a pod, detailed development plan for that pod is required to be submitted. And this plan identifies the area of native species that are proposed. The species proposed as part of the planting plan to help screen the development area from the water includes pine, white pine, birch, and spruce. So native species are what's proposed in the planting plan. I should mention too, I didn't include a slide in here, but there is a visual analysis that was completed, and it is on the municipality's website under the Macy Bay Document Center. And it provides an overview of how the site would look from a few different vantage points when viewed from Georgian Bay. So I'm just going to take a few moments to review some of the key aspects of the site plan of the report, and just touch, and as I go through those aspects, I'll also be touching on the public comments that have been received. I'm not going to specifically review each of the comments, but from a sort of a categorical perspective, the comments that were provided from the public really related to a few different topic areas. They related to traffic and road considerations, the water system, the sanitary system and the appropriateness of it, some environmental or natural heritage aspects, so the wetland, species at risk, fish habitat. Comments on concern about the density of the site and the overall number of units. There were some concerns about the public consultation that has occurred as part of the review of the application. Some folks felt there was not sufficient or not appropriate amount of public consultation. Some folks felt there was not enough time to review the site plan report and the agreement that has been prepared. There were comments pertaining to the waterfront and that there should be a for example, there should be a waterfront plan provided along with this application. There's concern about the increased amount of boating activity that could occur in the area of the site and proximate to the site based on the additional units that are proposed. There were some questions about how construction traffic and construction activities would be mitigated associated with the development. There was some questions related to the judicial review, which I've touched on briefly, and whether or not it's premature for council to consider the site plan application in light of the judicial review that's ongoing. And there were some comments related to, these were very recent last week, but support for 90 units now, but not supporting the full approval of the site plan. So I've done my best to try to characterize the areas of comments. There were some other areas, but these were sort of the main areas that we identified. And we've also tried to characterize those public comments through the preparation of the staff report. So now I'm just going to review just how these comments and how there's some additional items in this review that deal with how we've addressed some of these matters as part of the site plan report and also through the site plan application. So with respect to traffic and road considerations, increased signage is proposed on Honey Harbor Road. So, and the fact that Honey Harbor Road entrance exists, that the turn exists, and then also the need for, there was a comment in one of the reports about the potential need for a flashing beacon at the intersection of Macy Bay Road to alert people of the additional traffic volumes. The traffic experts have agreed that that should not be installed at this point in time, but it's something as development of this site proceeds in its phased manner that it should be something that be looked at on whether it's needed going forward based on increased traffic volumes. So that's one of the monitoring items that will occur as the development of the site proceeds. There's also a requirement for signage for 30-kilometer-an-hour road posting for Macy Bay Road. In order for that to happen, the township would have to enact a bylaw to, in accordance with the Municipal Act, to set the standard speed for the maximum speed for Macy Bay Road at 30 kilometers per hour. But the proponent would be required to pay for the signage associated with that. Additionally, there's some requirements for vegetation removal in the area of Honey Harbor Road and Macy Bay Road to improve sight lines. So the traffic signage and the vegetation removal are two of the aspects that are required to be completed before any permits are issued for the subject lands. One of the other items that isn't listed here is that prior to any construction proceeding, the proponent's engineer and the township engineer, this is ingrained in the site plan agreement, are required to do an inspection of Macy Bay Road and the standard of Macy Bay Road, and basically establish what that standard is, establish if there's any faults to the road currently in terms of breaking up pavement or anything like that. And a yearly inspection each spring is required to identify if the construction or if the traffic associated with the proposed development has damaged the road in any way. And the proponent would be required to pay for the fixing of the road up to the standard that currently exists today. So the intention of that clause in the site plan agreement is to ensure that the municipality is not on the hook for any damage to Macy Bay Road that occurs as a result of the proposed development. So that's one of the monitoring mechanisms that's ingrained in the site plan agreement that is there every year until full build out occurs. And I believe there's a year after full build out occurs that also has to take place. And then I know one of the other items relates to securities, and it's going to come up as part of the later slides. But from a securities perspective, the municipality would include collection of securities for the signage, for the vegetation removal, and then also collect an amount of securities for the repair of Macy Bay Road that will stay with the township until the development has been completed, to ensure that if there is any damage to Macy Bay Road and the proponent has not fixed it in a timely manner, the township can draw on those funds to ensure Macy Bay Road stays at the same condition that it is. And finally, just to summarize all of that, these are the modifications that have been recommended by the proponent and the peer reviewers, and have been agreed to as the traffic and road considerations that are necessary in order for the site plan approval to be provided for the proposed development. So both the proponent and the peer reviewer have agreed on these modifications. The next item I'd like to touch on is the water and sanitary sewer considerations. So again, it's a private water system. As I mentioned earlier, there's a permit to take water from the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, and the water demand associated with the site will be monitored. There's flow meters that will be installed that will monitor to ensure that there is sufficient water available as the build out of the development proceeds. So effectively, let's just say there's 30 units developed at the start. The flow rates of the site associated with those 30 units will be monitored and will enable a clear prediction on the water demand requirements for the future build out of the site. In terms of a sewage system, an ECA has been approved by MECP, which is Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Again, there is a judicial review associated with that. As far as the sewage system, the flows of the sewage system, similar to the water, will be monitored. So those flows will identify if the system has been correctly sized, whether it's too big, too small, or whether it's appropriate to support development going forward. But as the first units are built out, the continued monitoring of that system takes place. So if there's changes that need to be made to the system to address the flow rates that are realized, those changes can be provided through the monitoring requirements. And again, sewage system and water system must be functioning appropriately before building permits can be issued. I would also mention that should any of these systems not operate appropriately, the site can be shut down. What's important about this concept, or what differentiates this development from a pure residential development, is this is recreational based. It's a recreational based development. It's a private site. It's not housing from the perspective of providing permanent housing for individuals. So if there's an issue with compliance with the MECP permits and ECAs, the site could be shut down. People could be moved off site until the systems are functioning appropriately, and then the site can be opened back up. So it's a little bit different than a situation where we're developing a residential development that's quote unquote housing. And again, operation must occur in accordance with MECP requirements. So if any individual in the community identifies that there's a concern with the system, or the township identifies there's a concern with the system, a complaint can be made to the MECP, and the MOECP would investigate that complaint and require whatever measures as necessary to be made to ensure compliance with ministry requirements. So we did have a discussion with MOECP as well, just about these systems in general, because there are a few of them in the municipality, and what happens and when can comments be made. And they indicated that comments can be made even if things aren't posted on the environmental registry, that comments can be made at any point in time, and the MOECP would review those comments and investigate them if necessary. So I just wanted to make that clear to council as well. From an environmental perspective, I've alluded to some of the environmental aspects already in when we reviewed the site plan drawing. Construction mitigation measures are required to be completed prior to site alteration. That's ingrained in the site plan agreement. So things like silt fencing and protective barriers and those sorts of things are all required to be done as part of the construction mitigation plan and prior to any site alteration occurring. We don't, what this prevents is a situation of site alteration occurring and then the siltation being caused, or trees being removed that shouldn't be removed, or buffers being disturbed that shouldn't be disturbed. All these are required to be delineated, identified on the site, silt fencing to be installed, and then site alteration can occur. I've already discussed the development setbacks from the features, so that's specifically the setbacks from the provincially significant wetland and from the interior watercourse. The site plan agreement requires the establishment of barriers adjacent to some of these habitat areas to protect them from pedestrians or vehicles traveling through these areas. These items are ingrained in the environmental reports and also in the peer-reviewed reports prepared by the township, and are required to be implemented in accordance with the language in the site plan agreement. There's a requirement in the site plan agreement that there be no trails established in the buffer areas. So that's referring to the 30-meter buffer adjacent to the provincially significant wetland, and as well as the 15 to 25-meter buffer that's required adjacent to the north-south waterway. So that means like no nature trails or those sorts of things in those areas. There are a couple of instances where the existing trail network travels through those buffer areas. So the existing roadway, the ring road is what the terminology I've used previously, but there's existing areas where that traverses through the buffer areas. And those areas are proposed to be maintained as the roadways. Effectively, it reduces the overall amount of site alteration that occurs on the site if those areas are maintained. And that was ingrained in the environmental review that was completed and it was also considered as part of the peer review. And I believe M&R also provided comments with respect to the use of those existing trailways on the site that are located within those buffer areas. Low impact design tools. So I've alluded to this briefly as well in the consideration of how the development pod plans would be completed. But within those areas, there's a requirement from the supporting studies and in the site plan agreement that low impact design tools be used. So these are things like capturing rainwater on the site through the use of rain barrels, capturing rainwater on the site through the use of rain gardens, to effectively allow as much infiltration as possible on site, so it limits the amount of overland flows that are provided. Those are all ingrained in the stormwater management plans, and they'll be required to be reflected as part of the site grading plans and the detailed information that's provided for the development of each pod area prior to the issuance of building permits. And then finally, monitoring. The supporting studies that have been provided and peer reviewed require monitoring of features throughout the lifetime of the development, through the construction phases, through the build out phases, and through the occupancy phases. Monitoring of those features is required, and reporting on those features is required. So through that, it's conceivable that as the monitoring occurs, there may be additional environmental measures that might need to be undertaken to protect features. It all depends obviously on what the monitoring indicates or how the features are being protected. But if it's identified through the first phase of development, for example, the first 30 units, that there's additional improvements that are necessary to protect a feature or water course, then those recommendations would need to be made and completed prior to the additional build out. Just comment on the maximum number of units. The maximum number of units that are permitted in the CT2-6 zoning is 180 units. This is in effect zoning that was the subject to an Ontario Municipal Board decision and is currently in effect. From a site plan perspective, I wanted to make it clear to council, we had and residents in their comments, is that site plans are not the appropriate planning tool that are available to control density. Planners have a number of different tools, and the appropriate tool to control density is zoning, and the zoning does that by limiting the site to a maximum of 180 units. And that's ingrained in Section 34 of the Planning Act. Section 41 of the Planning Act that deals with site plan control, it specifically identifies what site plan control can regulate, or what site plan control what items it can apply to, and specifically density is not an item that can be controlled through site plan control. So in terms of limiting the number of units through a site plan agreement to something less than 180 units, I do not believe that's something that can be or is appropriate to do through site plan control. What I would like to just make very clear is that the development is to be phased and it is to be monitored throughout. So I don't know the specific reasons for why a lesser number of units would be preferred over the 180, why the 90 at this point in time, and considering further units in the future. I would assume it would relate to ensuring that monitoring takes place and the orderly development of the site takes place. It's my opinion that those items are ingrained in the site plan agreement currently, that there are currently requirements for monitoring of traffic, monitoring of sewage, monitoring of water, monitoring of environmental aspects, and that if changes are required to any of those items as a result of that monitoring, they can take place before future building permits are issued for additional trailer sites and the additional build out of the various pods. So I would suggest that those items are appropriately dealt with through the agreement that's been drafted. Just a few additional comments on fire. As I mentioned previously, the units have been sprinklered. There's a 6-meter main trailway which can accommodate fire vehicles, the township's fire vehicles. The 3-meter trailways are large enough to support and are required to be able to support a ambulance and also a mini pumper if the township has a mini or purchases a mini pumper. In terms of fire suppression storage tanks are required to be installed prior to building permits being issued. They're completed at a construction stage, and the storage tanks are required to ensure that there's sufficient firefighting capacity available for the maintenance building and the sewage building areas of the site. So those that's specifically the need for the fire suppression storage tank. There's proposed to be an internal emergency numbering system provided. That would be needed to be completed before there's any building permits issued for the site, and that there be a directory provided at the entrance. So any emergency responders responding to the site can look at the entrance directory and find out exactly where they're going within the site. Just in terms of construction considerations, and I've alluded to this, some of this already. So these are items that that are required prior to development proceeding on the site, and they're items that will be ingrained in the construction management plan that that is required by the site plan agreement. So road signage and vegetation removal would have to be completed before construction commences, and that's related to the entrance of, or the intersection of Honey Harbor Road and Macy Bay Road. The construction management plan that I've talked about needs to be completed. Inspection of the road that we've already talked about needs to be completed. Construction of the works would be supervised, so there would be a requirement from for supervision of the works by the township engineers, and inspections by the township environmental consultants to ensure that those environmental mitigation measures are in place. And there's a requirement for timing in the agreement that construction must commence within 24 months of the initiation of the agreement. And then finally, that the provincial approvals are required. So what's important about that last aspect is that site alteration cannot occur before the species at risk permit, for example, is provided, because we need to know the nature of that permit and what additional requirements for protection of the species are included in that permit before any site works can be undertaken. There's also a number of conditions ingrained in the site plan agreement that must be met prior to building permit issuance. So that's issuance of building permits related to the maintenance building or building permits related to the individual units. So the sewage system must be operational. The fire suppression tanks need to be installed. Development charges need to be paid. As council's aware, there's a current appeal outstanding to the development charges bylaw. If that appeal were not disposed of prior to building permits being sought by the developer, they would have the ability to submit building permits and submit development charge payment under what's called protest. And depending on the results of the development charge hearing, they would either not get funds back or receive funds back. But that's a standard practice that development charges can be paid under protest where there's an outstanding appeal. The last item identifies the submission of plans for units need to indicate a number of items. So this is also ingrained in the site plan agreement. So there's a requirement that Macy Bay try to use the existing graveled pass system as much as possible to minimize the disturbance to the landscape and effectively protect as much vegetation as possible throughout the site. Just a requirement that there be as minimal grading and soil disturbance as possible with respect to creating the roads and the infrastructure, that the natural buffers be protected and enhanced, and disturbed areas have to be appropriately revegetated. So we will be provided with the township will be provided with specific plans as each of these areas are proposed to be built out. And these are the sort of the checklist of items that are required to be considered by staff prior to issuing permits for or sign off on the various engineering plans. Sediment and erosion control measures need to be demonstrated and implemented. And again, I mentioned low impact design practices for each pod and each individual unit need to be demonstrated before sign off would be provided. So that completes an overview, and I know it's lengthy, but an overview of the site plan agreement and its details. Just in terms of the holding symbol and the removal of the holding symbol, what's listed here are the conditions that were required by the OMB. So the OMB decision specifies in the CT2-6H zone a number of conditions for removal of the holding symbol. And really all of these items come back, with the exception of item B, come back to the site plan agreement, as they're all components of the site plan agreement. So effectively, by approving the site plan agreement, the township would also be approving these other studies that have been completed and peer reviewed and signed off on by the various consultants of the municipality. So it's staff's opinion that these items have all been completed at this time, and for those reasons, it's appropriate to remove the holding symbol. It's pretty unusual that you would see, in my experience, it's pretty unusual that you see sort of this list of studies ingrained in a holding symbol removal. Typically, you would just see approval and execution of a site plan agreement as the condition for removal of the holding symbol. But in this case, the board and the township wanted to make it abundantly clear of the studies that needed to be provided in support of the site plan agreement, and that's why I believe they were listed in the decision. So in terms of recommendations, the recommendations are consistent with those that are outlined in the staff report. We do recommend that that council authorize the entering into of the site plan agreement by the enactment of bylaw 2020-048, and then subsequently that council authorize the removal of the holding symbol by enacting bylaw 2020-049. So the holding symbol wouldn't actually come off the site until that site plan agreement is entered into. As I mentioned, there's a couple of tweaks to some of the drawings that need to be completed. The amounts of securities need to be finalized with respect to the site plan agreement. So there's a couple of additional items that need to be finalized. But you do have a draft agreement that's included in the agenda package, which we believe, which has been provided to the applicant, and the applicant has commented on it. And we believe it's fairly close. It's very close to the agreement that will be entered into. I guess one thing I did mention earlier, I was going to provide a bit more detail on, was the securities and how securities would be provided for the development. The intention with respect to securities is that offsite, there would be securities provided for offsite features. There would be securities provided for on-site features, such as the items requiring the protection of the environmental features on the site. There would be securities collected for those. There would be securities collected for the fire infrastructure. The securities that are that would be collected for the engineering related items or the sewer and water systems, they would be, and the infrastructure that's going in the ground. We expect that the securities that are going to be collected for those would be less than what you typically see for a standard residential development, where you've got servicing under a municipal road or municipal servicing under a condo road. Reason for that is that there's two reasons. One, as I mentioned, this is a private site with private servicing, so there aren't municipal services in place. And the second reason is that the site can be closed down if there's an issue with respect to any of the servicing aspects of the site. The site can be, or would be, shut down, and people can be moved off the site. So the real nature of securities in this instance would be to ensure the systems, and to ensure that the site can be contained and brought back to the state necessary to preserve the infrastructure that's in place, but not necessarily the replacement of all the infrastructure, which is the sort of thing that we would see in a typical urban situation with respect to the amount of securities required. So I would suspect, based on and we'd also require full security, for the landscaping as well. So I'd suspect the securities will likely be in the range of sort of 30% what the costs of the development and the costs are. Those items are still to be finalized with the proponent, but that's the basis on how securities will be established for this site. It's not appropriate in this instance to collect securities for every piece of infrastructure that's going to be installed, because again, for the two reasons I've previously outlined. And the other item with respect to securities here, because the whole site is not being developed at one shot, it's expected that securities will be collected for the phase of the development that proceeds, and then those securities would be subsequently rolled over into subsequent phases of development. So for example, if the security requirement for the whole site is, for lack of a better number, let's say $1 million, but the requirement for securities for phase one and the environmental and the landscape and everything that goes along with it is 500, we'd be likely to collect 500,000, or the percentage of 500,000 that we need to collect for securities. And then that value would get pushed forward to subsequent phases as maintenance periods expire on the first phase. So that's pretty standard, or that's very standard with respect to development and how securities work. But the intent is that the municipality is protected, that so our principles for collecting securities are that the municipality is protected, the environment is protected, and that the views and offsite impacts are protected. So those are the principles upon which securities would be collected for the site. So that completes my presentation. I'm sure there'll be some questions, and I'm sorry for the long-winded nature of it, but there's a lot of information to cover, and if there's questions, I'd be happy to do my best to try to answer those.
Well, Mr. Robinson, thank you very much for your presentation. It's greatly appreciated, though as thorough as it was, I don't doubt there'll be a list of questions, and I'm going to turn this over to council. But before I do, I'm going to suggest a 5-minute break. We'll have a quick bio break and everybody can catch their breath, and then let's get back and do get to the questions. So let's get back here at, I'm going to call 11:11. Thank you.